The portrait shows a queen frozen in time, calm, powerful, draped in silk and certainty. Queen Victoria gazes out from museum walls as the embodiment of order, discipline, and moral authority. To generations raised in imperial history, she represents an age when Britain believed it carried civilization like a torch into the world's darkness. But paintings lie if you step away from the polished galleries and instead open the government ledger. Of Britain in the late 1830s, a very different picture emerges, one stripped of honor, stripped of romance. What you find there is not the accounting of a noble empire, but the balance sheet of a desperate operation teetering on collapse. By 1839, the British Empire was not thriving. It was bleeding. The engine that powered Britain's global dominance ran on money, and that engine was sputtering. War, administration, ships, salaries, and trade routes consumed vast sums. And at the center of this fragile system was a single commodity the British people could no longer live without: tea. Tea was not a luxury. It was survival. Factory workers relied on it to endure brutal shifts in smoke-filled mills. Aristocrats used it as social ritual. Government coffers depended on taxes from its import. Tea was Britain's fuel. Culturally and economically, there was just one problem. Britain didn't control tea. The plant grew almost exclusively in China, and the Chinese Empire had little interest in British goods. Wool was useless in a land of silk. Machinery meant nothing to scholars whose civilization had mapped the stars centuries earlier. Decorative trinkets failed to impress a court that saw itself as the center of the world. So China demanded payment in silver, and Britain paid. Year after year, ship after ship left British ports loaded with silver bullion, returning with crates of dried leaves. The imbalance was catastrophic. The empire's wealth drained eastward like blood from an open wound. Reserves fell. Currency stability wavered. The financial foundations of empire began to crack. Inside the boardrooms of Britain's most powerful trading institution, panic replaced pride. If the silver kept flowing out, Britain would face ruin. The solution had to be radical. It had to bypass diplomacy, culture, and even morality. It had to exploit something deeper than economics. How? Human weakness. The answer they settled on was not innovation, nor trade reform. It was addiction. Opium. This was not a side hustle run by criminals in shadows. It was a system engineered with bureaucratic precision. In colonial India, British administrators created a state monopoly over opium production. Farmers were coerced into destroying food crops and replacing them with poppies. Refusal meant punishment. Compliance meant survival. Factories rose along the Ganges, vast and methodical. Inside, workers labored knee-deep in narcotic paste, stirring, pressing, shaping. Opium was measured, stamped, standardized. Each brick bore the authority of empire. This was not chaos. It was industrialized poison. Yet a legal problem remained. Opium was illegal in China. Selling it openly would expose Britain as a criminal power. So the empire built a veil of deniability. The drugs were auctioned to private traders who would take the risks. Officially, Britain was clean. Unofficially, it controlled everything. Fast ships, armed crews, protected routes, offshore warehouses, corrupt officials, gangs. Smugglers moved opium into China while silver flowed back out, reversing the hemorrhage. The numbers exploded. By the late 1830s, tens of thousands of chests entered China every year. Addiction spread like wildfire. Villages hollowed out. Soldiers sold weapons for another dose. Officials neglected duties. The Chinese economy buckled under the loss of silver. What Britain called trade, China experienced as slow destruction. The empire had solved its crisis, at the cost of another civilization's collapse, and China would not endure it forever. What may? The system so dangerous was not just the drug itself, but how efficiently it was produced and distributed. This was not an underworld trade fueled by desperation and disorder. It was an enterprise run with the discipline of a modern corporation, backed by an imperial authority and protected by naval power. In eastern India, especially in Bengal, the British colonial administration tightened its grip. Farmers were no longer free to choose what they grew. Contracts were enforced with threats. Food crops disappeared, replaced by endless fields of poppies whose milky sap would be scraped, collected, and refined into opium paste. Hunger followed. But hunger was an acceptable cost. The factories that processed the drug became symbols of something new in world history: state-managed narcotics production. Vast halls echoed with the sound of labor. Workers stirred thick black paste in massive vats, their clothes soaked, their skin stained. Barrels were sealed. Cakes were molded. Everything was measured, recorded, and approved. Nothing was left to chance. This was the Industrial Revolution applied not to steel or textiles, but to dependency. Each unit of opium was marked, catalogued, and prepared for export. The British didn't just sell a drug, they sold consistency. Buyers knew exactly what they were getting. Strength was predictable, quality was reliable, addiction could be planned. But the empire still needed distance from the crime. So the final step was outsourced. At auctions in Calcutta, opium was sold to private merchants. On paper, these men were independent traders. In reality, they were partners in a system that protected them at every level. The British Navy guarded the seas. British diplomats defended their interests. British banks handled the profits. One of these traders stood out. William Jardine was not born a criminal. He was trained as a physician. He understood the body, he understood pain, and he understood profit. Where others hesitated, Jardine saw opportunity. He built fast ships, armed them heavily, and turned the coastline of southern China into a floating marketplace of narcotics. The ships never docked. They anchored just offshore, beyond the reach of Chinese law. From there, smaller vessels ferried opium inland. Bribes smoothed the way. Local gangs handled distribution. Addiction did the rest. Silver poured back into British hands. The imbalance that once threatened the empire reversed almost overnight. Tea continued to flow west. Silver now flowed east, then circled back into British banks. The crisis was solved, balance sheets were covered, the empire stabilized. But China unraveled. By the late 1830s, the scale of addiction shocked even seasoned officials. Entire regions were affected. Men who once worked fields and workshops lay motionless in smoke-filled rooms. Government offices stalled. Military readiness collapsed as soldiers sold weapons to fund their habit. Silver, the backbone of China's economy, vanished from circulation. Prices soared. Poverty deepened. Unrest spread. From the throne in Beijing, the emperor watched his empire weaken not through invasion but through decay. This was not just a public health crisis. It was an existential threat. China had faced foreign enemies before. Armies could be fought. Borders could be defended. But how do you fight a substance that dissolves discipline, ambition, and loyalty from the inside? For years, the court hesitated. Corruption ran deep. Many officials were compromised. Others feared confronting foreign powers whose ships bristled with cannons. But eventually, delay became impossible. The emperor needed someone incorruptible, someone unafraid, someone willing to confront not only smugglers, but the empire behind them. He chose Lin Zexu. Lin was a scholar, a poet, and a rare thing in a decaying system, a man whose reputation for integrity was unquestioned. He believed law mattered. He believed morality mattered. And he believed China could still be saved. When Lin arrived in Canton in 1839, he did not negotiate, he acted. Chinese dealers were arrested by the thousands. Addicts were rounded up and forced into treatment camps. The message was brutal and clear. The era of tolerance was over. But Lin understood something crucial. Punishing victims would never be enough. The source had to be cut off. He turned his attention to the foreign merchants who lived in protected enclaves along the coast. These men lived comfortably, surrounded by goods, servants, and privilege, while the country around them suffered. Lin issued an ultimatum. Hand over every ounce of opium. Sign a pledge to never trade it again, or face consequences. The merchants stalled, confident that British power would shield them. Lin responded by surrounding their quarters with troops. Supplies were cut. Streets were barricaded. Drums and gongs sounded through the night, denying sleep, denying comfort. The pressure worked. Inside the enclave, the British superintendent of trade realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Fear replaced arrogance. Lives were at risk. A decision had to be made. The order was given. The opium was surrendered. More than 20,000 chests were seized in amount, so vast it represented months of nationwide addiction. Lin ordered trenches dug along the shoreline. The opium was crushed, mixed with lime and salt, and destroyed in a chemical reaction that turned profit into waste. For weeks, the pits boiled. China had made its stand. What Lin did not know was that this act of justice would be interpreted elsewhere as an act of war. For Lin Zexu, the destruction of the opium was not an act of defiance. It was an act of responsibility. He believed that any sovereign nation had the right, no, the duty to protect its people from harm. He believed that law applied equally to all, whether local dealer or foreign merchant. But thousands of miles away, in London, the same event was interpreted very differently. The news arrived not as a moral victory, but as a financial disaster. To British officials and merchants, Lin's actions were framed not as enforcement of Chinese law, but as theft. Property had been seized. Contracts had been broken. Profits had vanished into the sea. and someone, they argued, had to pay. The men who had profited most from the trade did not retreat into silence. They advanced. William Jardine crossed continents to plead his case before the British government. He did not speak of addiction, villages destroyed, or families ruined. He spoke the language that mattered: money, trade, and national pride. He spread maps across polished tables. He pointed to China's vulnerable coastline, its rivers, its ports. He assured ministers that Chinese defenses were outdated, their weapons obsolete. He argued that British honor had been insulted, that free trade had been violated, and he made a promise: a short war, a decisive victory, a profitable outcome. Britain's leaders listened closely, not because they were eager for conflict, but because they were cornered. The empire was still fragile. Tea taxes were essential. Silver reserves mattered. And now the government faced massive compensation claims from merchants whose opium had been destroyed. The choice was stark: they accept the loss and respect China's laws, or use force to make China reimburse Britain for destroying an illegal drug. They chose force. In the summer of 1840, a fleet set sail from India toward China. It was not merely a naval expedition. It was a preview of a new world order. Industry, technology, and warfare merged into a single instrument of coercion. At the center of the fleet was a ship, unlike anything Asia had ever seen, the Nemesis. Built of iron, driven by steam, immune to wind and tide, it could travel upriver where wooden warships could not. To Chinese defenders, it looked unnatural, smoking, grinding, moving against the current as if alive. Their own fleets were relics, wooden junks, old cannons, weapons unchanged for centuries. The mismatch was not just military, it was historical. What followed was less a war than a demonstration. British ships shelled coastal forts with impunity. Cannons thundered. Rockets screamed overhead. Chinese defenses crumbled. Cities burned. Rivers fell under foreign control. The British did not need to occupy the interior. They simply strangled the empire at its arteries. Tax barges were seized. Grain shipments intercepted. The threat was clear: submit or starve. Chinese soldiers fought bravely. Many stood their ground despite overwhelming firepower. But courage could not stop iron hulls and explosive shells. Entire units were wiped out in minutes. As British forces pushed north, panic spread through the imperial court. The emperor struggled to understand what was happening. How could a distant island nation dismantle China's defenses so easily? The answer was brutal. China was fighting the future with the past. By 1842, British ships sailed up the Yangtze River and aimed their guns at Nanjing, one of China's great ancient cities. The ultimatum was simple: surrender or watch the city burn. Faced with annihilation, the emperor capitulated. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials boarded a British warship and signed a document under the shadow of naval guns. It would become known as the Treaty of Nanjing. In China, it is remembered as the first of the unequal treaties. The terms were devastating. China was forced to pay massive indemnities in silver. Ports were open to foreign trade without Chinese legal authority. British citizens were placed beyond local law. And perhaps most bitterly, China was forced to compensate Britain for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed. Illegal drugs, smuggled in violation of Chinese law, paid for by the victims. The treaty also included a territorial concession that would reshape history. A small island off China's southern coast was ceded to Britain indefinitely: Hong Kong. At the time, British officials dismissed it as worthless, a rocky outcrop with little apparent value, but merchants knew better. It was perfectly positioned: deep harbor, strategic access, absolute protection under British law. Hong Kong became the nerve center of the opium trade. From there, the flow intensified. Production in India expanded. Distribution networks hardened. Addiction deepened across China. By the late 19th century, opium revenues formed a crucial pillar of Britain's imperial finances in Asia. Railways, bureaucracies, and fleets were funded by dependency. For China, the psychological damage ran deeper than the economic loss. The war shattered centuries of belief. The Middle Kingdom, long convinced of its cultural superiority, had been humiliated by gunboats and merchants. This trauma would echo for generations. The line Lin Zexu tried to draw had been erased by force, and the consequences were only beginning. The war ended, but the damage did not. For China, the Treaty of Nanjing was not a conclusion. It was the beginning of a long unraveling. Foreign powers followed Britain's example, demanding their own concessions, ports, and privileges. Law fragmented, sovereignty thinned. What had once been an empire confident in its place at the center of the world now struggled to defend even its borders. This period would later be known as the Century of Humiliation, a phrase that still carries emotional weight in modern China. It was an era defined by internal rebellion, foreign interference, and the steady erosion of control. The Opium War did not merely weaken China, it reshaped how the nation understood itself. Addiction continued to spread. Despite occasional reforms and crackdowns, the trade expanded throughout the 19th century. British-controlled production in India surged to meet demand. By the late 1800s, thousands of tons of opium flowed into China annually. Entire communities were hollowed out, their productivity replaced by dependency. The irony was cruel. The same empire that preached morality, discipline, and progress at home funded its overseas dominance by exporting collapse abroad. The wealth generated by opium helped build railways, expand ports, and maintain fleets that projected British power across the globe. This was the unspoken foundation of imperial prosperity. Hong Kong stood at the center of it all. Under British protection, the island transformed from a neglected outpost into a thriving commercial hub. Warehouses rose along the harbor. Ships came and went freely. Profits multiplied. The opium trade was not hidden, it was organized, insured, and normalized. The men who orchestrated this system did not face justice. William Jardine returned to Britain not in disgrace but in triumph. He entered politics. His business empire expanded. His company evolved, shifting from narcotics into shipping, finance, and real estate. Over time, its name became synonymous not with crime, but with respectability. Streets were named, buildings erected, legacies polished. History was edited. In Britain, the Opium War faded into footnotes, softened by language about trade disputes and diplomatic misunderstandings. In China, it became a scar passed down through generations, a reminder of vulnerability and betrayal. Even when Britain eventually curtailed the opium trade in the early 20th century, it was not driven by sudden moral clarity. The empire had changed. New sources of revenue replaced old ones. The drug was no longer essential. The damage, however, was irreversible. China's distrust of foreign powers hardened. National memory crystallized around the lesson that strength, not good, will determine survival. This worldview would shape revolutions, policies, and international relationships well into the modern era. When contemporary Chinese leaders speak about sovereignty, about resisting external pressure, about never allowing the nation to be humiliated again, they are not speaking in abstractions. They are referencing lived history, the smoke-filled rooms, the gunboats on the rivers, the treaties signed under threat. The past is not past. There is a final irony in the story of the Opium Wars. The same forces that once justified violence in the name of free trade later claimed the moral high ground in global politics. The language changed, but the imbalance of power remained. The lesson, however, had been learned. Trust is fragile. Once a nation is poisoned, literally and metaphorically, it does not forget who held the bottle. Queen Victoria ruled for more than 6 decades, celebrated as a symbol of stability and grace. But behind the image was an empire that had crossed a line, one that blurred the distinction between governance and organized crime. The tea in British cups carried unseen costs. The silver in imperial vaults came from shattered lives. History often tells us that progress is inevitable, that humanity moves forward in a straight line toward enlightenment. The Opium War tells a different story. It shows us that progress is frequently financed by suffering, that morality bends when profits are threatened, and that power, once tasted, rarely asks permission. The legacy of the Queen's cartel is not just found in textbooks or treaties. It lives in modern geopolitics, in suspicion between nations, in the unspoken, understanding that economic pressure can be as destructive as war. The ghosts of that era linger not as myths, but as warnings. They remind us that sovereignty is not guaranteed, that laws mean little without strength to enforce them, and that when empire forces another society to consume its poison, reconciliation becomes nearly impossible. This is why the Opium War still matters. Not because it is ancient history, but because it explains the present. And once you see it clearly, you begin to understand why some wounds never heal,